Evolution, reconstruction meets innovation.
Evolution. Let's build the future together.
Okay, so you know that feeling, right, when you're like really trying to understand something important, but you're just bombarded with information? It's like you're drowning in it.
Yeah, totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. And that is exactly why we do the deep dive. We take all those sources and all that information, kind of boil it down to the really important stuff.
We basically curate it all just for you.
Exactly. Think of it as like a fast track to being in the know.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And you actually shared with us some really fascinating material from a blog called Bovolution by Christian K. Carl. And it's about something that's on everyone's minds these days, which is, AI, artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah. AI is everywhere.
It is. And particularly what we're looking at today are the potential downsides, the risks.
The possible dark side of AI.
Yeah. Now, Bovolution, just so everyone's on the same page, it's a really interesting blog. It's all about like the evolution of ideas, especially in the fields of like building, digitalization, and of course, AI.
And Christian Carl, the author, he's got this like really critical perspective, which is refreshing, He's not just looking at the shiny positive side of AI. He's asking those tough questions about the potential downside.
He's digging deeper.
Exactly. And you, our listener, you specifically mentioned wanting to get those key insights without getting lost in the weeds. No technical jargon overload.
Right, to the point.
Exactly.
So that's exactly what we're aiming for today. We're going to break down these 15 potential downsides of AI that Christian Carl lays out in his blog posts.
And we'll add some context and think about possible ways to, address those challenges.
All right. So let's get started with the first one. And this is about the exploitation of what are called click workers by AI.
Right. So this one, it's interesting because it highlights the often unseen human labor that actually drives a lot of AI progress.
Yeah, we often focus on the algorithms and the technology, but there's a whole layer of manual work going on behind the scenes, and that's where these click workers come in.
Exactly. They're the ones doing these super important but often overlooked tasks like, tagging images, categorizing data.
It's like the groundwork, right? The foundation.
Exactly. Without that, the AI systems can't really learn.
Right. And what Bovolution points out is that this isn't just some abstract concept. This is actually happening right now in like the building and real estate industry. So think about AI analyzing satellite images to figure out property values.
Yeah, that seems pretty high tech.
It is, but before that AI can even get started, you've got click workers who are tagging all those images, right?
Yeah.
They're identifying buildings, roads, green spaces, all that stuff.
So it's like a vital but hidden step in the process.
Exactly. And unfortunately, Christian Carl, he draws on reports from news sources like Tagesschau and Spiegel, and he points out that a lot of these click workers face really low pay.
And difficult working conditions, too.
Yeah, so it really raises this question of, what's the real cost of AI development?
Right, like we celebrate all these advancements, but are we overlooking the fact that some of them are built on this foundation of undervalued labor?
Right. In Bovolution, it goes on to outline a bunch of like really core challenges that come with this. Like you said, unfair compensation, terrible working conditions.
Yeah.
But also bigger societal questions about wealth distribution.
Yeah. Could AI be contributing to widening the gap between the rich and the poor?
It's a valid concern.
Absolutely. And there are also legal risks for the companies involved and the risk of damage to their reputation. Consumers getting upset if they find out about these practices.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole sustainability angle, too, which is that, high turnover, low morale in that workforce that's not sustainable in the long run.
No, it undermines the whole system.
So the question then is, what can we actually do about this?
Well, Bovolution offers some potential solutions, so transparency is really key here.
Like companies need to be upfront about how they're getting their data labeled.
Exactly. And they need to develop fairer ways to pay these workers. And the working conditions themselves need to improve, making sure people have enough breaks, reasonable workloads.
That's about basic human dignity.
Absolutely. And then, there might be a need for some regulation at some point to establish like minimum standards for these workers.
Like a safety net.
Exactly. So moving on to the second potential downside that Bovolution talks about. And this is about how AI can actually make existing social inequalities even worse.
Yeah, and this is super relevant right now.
Oh, yeah, especially with all the talk about bias and algorithms.
It's a big deal.
Huge. And the core issue here is that AI systems They learn from the data that they're trained on, right? That's how they
Right.
work.
They see patterns, they make connections.
Exactly. And the problem is, as Bovolution points out, and they cite Lopez here, that a lot of this historical data, it reflects existing societal biases and inequalities.
Because, society hasn't always been fair.
Unfortunately not. So when AI is trained on that data, it can accidentally perpetuate and even amplify those inequalities.
So it's not that AI is intentionally biased, it's that it's learning from biased data.
Right. And it can make those biases even worse.
And we've actually seen real-world examples of this, like Bovolution mentions Microsoft's Tay chatbot.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic example.
And if you remember that chatbot, it was designed to learn from interactions on Twitter. And it didn't take long for it to start generating really offensive content.
It picked up the worst of what it was exposed to.
Yeah, which was like a really clear reminder that, these systems, they can pick up negative patterns very, very quickly. And Carl specifically brings this into the building and real estate context. He uses the example of AI being used in property valuations and loan applications.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
And how it could potentially discriminate against certain groups of people based purely on their postal code, because certain areas have historically faced disadvantage, and that data is fed into the AI.
So it's perpetuating those historical...
Exactly. And interestingly, Bovolution also mentions a legal case. The EU Court of Justice ruling that actually limited the use of these Schufa scores, which are like creditworthiness scores in Germany.
So even the legal system is having to figure out how to deal with these algorithmic fairness issues.
Yeah. And, when we start thinking about the bigger picture, it's like these inequalities, they can become baked into the AI system itself.
And Bovolution highlights some pretty serious challenges that come with this, like the fact that these biases can be invisible and really hard to detect.
Right. And it leads to this unequal distribution of opportunities and resources, like who gets access to housing, who gets loans.
And then you have this risk of increasing social tensions because certain groups are constantly being marginalized.
It's a big concern. So if these biases are actually embedded in the data that we use to train these AI systems, how do we even begin to tackle that?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it really comes down to how we design and use this technology right from the start. So Bovolution suggests a few things. First of all, we need more awareness. We need to be transparent about these potential biases. We can't just pretend they don't exist.
We need to talk about it.
Exactly. We also need to diversify the data that we use to train AI. So instead of feeding it a narrow slice of data, we need to make it as representative as possible.
Right. Like a more complete picture of society.
Exactly. And then having, ethical guidelines and frameworks can provide some structure and accountability.
So it's not just a free-for-all.
Right. And perhaps most importantly, we need to get diverse communities involved in the process of actually developing this AI.
Yeah, like from the ground up.
Right. Because that's going to help ensure that we're considering a wider range of perspectives and that we're minimizing the risk of negative impacts.
So the third potential downside that Bovolution talks about is probably the one that gets the most attention, and that's the loss of jobs due to AI. This is a concern we hear a lot about, with automation on the rise.
Yeah, and it's a valid concern. I mean, Bovolution addresses this head on, and they even reference Kaufman, who's written about how AI is now able to do tasks that used to require highly skilled professionals.
So it's not just about, machines taking over like factory jobs anymore.
Right. It's reaching into professions that require education and training.
Right. And the article actually gives some concrete examples within the building and real estate industries. So, for instance, you've got AI-powered drones and monitoring systems that are now reducing the need for manual labor on construction sites.
Makes sense.
And you've also got software that can streamline a lot of the work that architects and engineers used to do.
Yeah, so it's like automating the design and planning processes.
Right. And Bovolution, it goes on to lay out all the challenges that this creates.
Yeah.
So obviously there's the direct loss of manual jobs, but also the potential for qualified personnel in planning and administration to be replaced by AI systems.
Mm-hmm.
And then even those repetitive tasks that are now being automated that might seem good at first, but it actually has a big impact on overall employment.
Yeah, because those tasks, they provide jobs for a lot of people.
Right. And then there's the huge issue of retraining programs.
Right. Are we equipping workers with the new skills they'll need to adapt to these changes?
Exactly. Because if we don't, then we end up with a situation where more and more people are unemployed, and we're seeing even greater social inequality.
This is a real societal challenge.
It is. And, when we zoom out a bit, technological progress, it's always reshaped the way we work.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's happened throughout history.
Right. But the question now is whether the pace and scale of AI-driven automation is just too fast for us to adapt.
Right. Are we cheaping up?
Exactly. And Bovolution lays out some possible responses to this. So promoting further education and skills development is going to be essential.
So giving people the tools to succeed in this new landscape.
Right. And then fostering the creation of new jobs, through innovation in fields like maybe sustainable building technologies. And then maybe we need to rethink our social support systems. Like maybe we need a basic income to support people who lose their jobs due to automation.
Like a safety net.
Yeah, exactly. And we also need stronger communication and collaboration between employers, employees, and the government.
Yeah, like everyone needs to be at the table.
Absolutely. And then finally, we need to think about guidelines for AI implementation that take these human factors into account.
Right. It can't just be about efficiency.
Exactly. So moving on to the next downside that Bovolution brings up, which is data protection.
Privacy. Huge issue.
Huge. And especially in an industry like this, building and real estate, where there's so much sensitive information flying around.
Right. You've got people's personal data, financial transactions, building data sensor readings, the list goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And Bovolution really highlights this drawing on research from Spengler and Carl.
Yeah, and they make the point that with AI, it can collect and analyze just mountains of data, and that creates a lot of potential vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and they use the example of smart buildings.
Oh, yeah, perfect example. So you've got these buildings gathering information on residents' habits, their preferences, all sorts of stuff.
Which, on the one hand, it can be used to optimize the building to make it more efficient.
Yeah, make it more comfortable for the people living there.
Right. But then on the other hand, it's like, who has access to all that data and what are they doing with it?
Right. It's a trade-off. Convenience and efficiency versus privacy.
Yeah. In Bovolution, they lay out the core challenges here. So, you've got the potential for misuse of the data that's collected.
Yeah.
You've got the violation of privacy, which can erode trust.
Yeah, and people feeling like they've lost control over their own information.
Right, like they don't have a say. And then, of course, there's always the risk of data breaches and leaks.
Which is a constant worry in this digital age.
It is. And, if we think about this in a broader context, data privacy, it's a massive societal concern.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So Bovolution, they offer some potential countermeasures.
Yeah.
So, having really robust data protection guidelines, that's like a no-brainer. And then this principle of data minimization, only collect the data that's absolutely necessary.
Don't just hoard it for no reason.
Right. And then, of course, really strong security measures like encryption are essential.
Got to keep that data safe.
Yeah. And then giving individuals more control over their own data.
So they can decide what's shared and what's not.
Right. That can help build trust. And then ultimately, developing AI in a way that has privacy baked in from the very beginning.
Privacy by design.
Yeah. So the fifth potential downside that Bovolution highlights is, I think, a really interesting one. It's this idea of the homogenization of urban space through AI.
Yeah, that's thought-provoking.
It is. So the idea is that if we're using algorithms to optimize everything for efficiency, we might end up with cities that all look the same.
Yeah, we'd lose that architectural and cultural diversity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Bovolution, they actually reference Schweitzer, who's written about this, about how AI-driven planning tools, they tend to prioritize things like efficiency and cost effectiveness.
Which makes sense from like a purely economic standpoint.
It does. But as a result, you might end up with, standardized designs for everything.
Cookie cutter buildings.
Yeah. And Bovolution gives the example of like AI algorithms for planning residential complexes and how they might favor these really repetitive designs.
Which might be cheaper to build, but could end up making all our cities look identical.
Yeah, exactly. You can almost picture it, right? Like every city is starting to look and feel the same, losing that unique character that makes them special.
Yeah, it's a bit dystopian.
It is. And Bovolution breaks down the challenges that this presents. So you've got the loss of cultural identity, you've got the neglect of the unique social needs of different communities, and just an overall decrease in the diversity of our architecture and our urban planning.
It's like we're losing the soul of our cities.
Yeah, in a way. So it really begs the question, what are the values that we want to prioritize as we develop our urban spaces? And Bovolution offers some ideas. So engaging local stakeholders in the planning process, that's huge.
Making sure the community has a voice.
Exactly. And then promoting diversity within those AI development teams themselves.
So it's not just a bunch of people with the same background and the same perspective making all the decisions.
Right. Bringing in different viewpoints. And then establishing some kind of guidelines or a governance structure specifically for AI in urban planning.
So it's not just the Wild West.
Right, some rules of the road.
Yeah.
And then I think this is a big one, viewing AI as a tool to support human decision-making, not as a replacement.
Right. AI should be helping us, not dictating to us.
Exactly. And then finally, encouraging innovation that actually works to preserve and enhance diversity.
So thinking about how AI can actually be a force for good in our cities.
Exactly. Okay. So the sixth potential downside that Bovolution highlights is about ethical concerns in decision-making by AI. And, as these AI systems are becoming more and more autonomous, the ethical implications get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, especially when it comes to fairness and justice, which Bovolution points out, citing Barton and Popelbus.
And in sectors like building and real estate, where these decisions can have a huge impact on people's lives, these concerns are even more pronounced.
Yeah, because we're talking about people's homes, their livelihoods.
Exactly. And Bovolution, they bring back the example of AI algorithms being used for property valuation and for approving or denying loans.
Which, as we discussed before, could potentially perpetuate discriminatory practices based on historical data.
Right. Like that connection between biased data and unfair outcomes, it keeps coming up.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme.
And Bovolution, it breaks down the core challenges here. So, the lack of transparency in these AI decision-making processes.
Yeah, it's the black box problem, right? We don't always know how AI is arriving at its decisions.
And then it makes it difficult to hold anyone accountable when something goes wrong.
Right, because who's to blame? The AI, the people who programmed it.
Exactly. And then there's the fundamental issue of fairness and potential bias stemming from that data that's used to train these systems.
So it's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
And, if we think about the bigger picture, public trust in AI, it really hinges on our ability to ensure that these systems operate fairly and ethically.
Absolutely. So Bovolution, they offer some potential solutions. So developing clear ethical guidelines for AI use, that's essential.
Like a set of principles.
Right. And then using tools that can actually explain AI decisions so that we can address that black box problem. And having independent bodies review and audit these AI systems on a regular basis that can help us identify and correct any potential biases.
So kind of keeping an eye on things.
Exactly. And then, of course, promoting diversity within those development teams.
Right. Different perspectives, different voices.
Absolutely. And then finally, strengthening the legal framework that governs the responsible use of AI.
So having those legal guardrails in place.
Exactly. Okay, so the seventh potential downside that Bovolution talks about is this idea of developing a technological dependence on AI.
Yeah, it's what happens if we become too reliant on it? What happens if the systems fail? Or if there's a cyber attack?
Right, and Bovolution actually references the EU Parliament, which has expressed concerns about this.
So it's on people's radar.
Oh, yeah. And this is particularly concerning in sectors like construction and real estate, where you have essential infrastructure that people rely on.
Things need to work.
Exactly. So Bovolution uses the example of those automated building management systems, or BMS. So these are the systems that control things like heating, ventilation, security, all that stuff.
Yeah, basically keeping the building running smoothly.
Right. And while they offer a lot of benefits in terms of efficiency, they also create a dependence on technology.
Yeah, it's like putting all our eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And that makes us more vulnerable.
In Bovolution, they lay out some of the key challenges that come with this. So, you've got the vulnerability to system failures, which could lead to financial losses or even safety risks.
Yeah, if the system goes down, suddenly people could be in danger.
Right. And then you've got the constant threat of cyber attacks.
Which could give someone unauthorized control over essential building functions.
Scary thought.
It is. And then there's this potential erosion of human know-how.
Yeah, if we're so reliant on the technology, we might forget how to do things ourselves.
Exactly. And then there are also broader social implications about who has access to this technology and who doesn't.
Right. So it's about equity and fairness as well.
Absolutely. So Bovolution suggests that we need to strike a balance between embracing innovation and maintaining operational resilience.
So it's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about being smart about it.
Right. And they offer some practical measures we can take. So having redundancy in place and backup systems.
Just in case.
Exactly. Implementing strong cybersecurity protocols and continuing to train people, so we don't lose those essential skills even if we're relying on technology.
Right. Staying sharp.
Absolutely. And then developing guidelines for technology use that consider these potential dependencies. And then involving all the relevant stakeholders in the implementation process from the very beginning.
So bringing everyone to the table.
Right, because if we're all aware of the risks and the potential consequences, then we can work together to mitigate them.
Okay, so let's move on to the eighth potential downside that Balvolution highlights, which is this idea of unforeseen ecological impacts of AI.
Right, and this is one that I think sometimes gets overlooked.
Yeah, because on the surface, it seems like AI could be a powerful tool for addressing environmental problems.
Yeah, like optimizing energy usage in buildings, for example.
Exactly. And Balvolution, they acknowledge the potential, they reference things like AI being used for waste, sorting with a nod to the BMUV.
So it's not
Definitely not. But they also point out that there are significant energy demands involved in actually training and operating these AI systems.
Yeah, they cite the Deutscher Bundestag here.
And they mentioned that one statistic about how, like, a single ChatGPT query, it can consume significantly more energy than a typical web search.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. And then they bring it back to building automation.
Mm-hmm.
So AI is being used to make buildings more energy efficient. But all that hardware, the energy used to manufacture it, power it, and eventually dispose of it, it all adds up.
Right, it's like a hidden environmental cost.
It is. And Balvolution, they outline some of the key challenges here. So you've got the high energy consumption of the AI systems themselves and the data centers where they're housed.
Yeah, those things are massive.
They are. And then you got this whole growing problem of electronic waste as technology advances at such a rapid pace.
Yeah, what happens to all those old computers and servers?
Exactly. And then you've got the fact that producing all this AI hardware is really resource intensive. And then even the impact on land use as we expand the infrastructure needed to support these systems.
So it's a multifaceted problem.
It is. But Balvolution, they do offer some potential solutions. So increasing the energy efficiency of AI algorithms and the hardware itself.
So they can do more with less energy.
Right. And then transitioning to renewable energy sources to power that AI infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then improving our recycling and reuse of electronic components.
To tackle that e-waste problem.
Right. And then, potentially implementing some kind of regulations that set environmental standards for AI development. And then raising awareness and educating people about the ecological footprint of AI.
So that everyone's more conscious of the impact.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on to the ninth potential downside that Balvolution discusses. And this is the potential for AI to be used for manipulation and control.
Oh yeah, this is a big one.
It is. And Balvolution, they talk about how AI's ability to analyze and predict human behavior, it can be used in some pretty subtle ways to influence people's choices.
Yeah, it's like almost subliminal.
Right. And they mention the whole issue of deepfakes.
Which is a big concern these days.
It is. And the BSI, they've actually released guidelines on how to detect and combat deepfakes.
So it's a real threat.
It is. And Balvolution also mentions some researchers like Bengio who've expressed concerns about the potential for even broader societal manipulation through AI.
So like influencing public opinion, for example.
Exactly. And then Balvolution, they bring it back to the building and real estate industry, and they use the example of AI being used in marketing.
Oh, yeah, so like targeted advertising.
Exactly, like using data to create these hyper-personalized ads that can really sway people's decisions.
So it's like AI is figuring out what makes you tick and then using that to influence you.
Right, and it can be really hard to even realize that it's happening.
Yeah, it can be very subtle.
It can. So Balvolution, they outline the key challenges here. So, the erosion of privacy as more and more data is collected to fuel these manipulations, the targeting of specific groups with very tailored messages, and then this potential for AI to actually reinforce existing biases because of the way it's trained, which can then impact the choices people make.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It can be. So it really raises this question of, autonomy and free will in a world that's increasingly driven by algorithms.
Yeah, like are we really in control of our own decisions?
Exactly. So Balvolution suggests some countermeasures. So transparency about how data is being collected and used, that's super important. Strengthening those data protection regulations. Developing ethical guidelines specifically for AI deployment that focus on preventing this kind of manipulation. Promoting AI literacy so that people understand how these systems work. And then, implementing regulatory oversight to ensure that these technologies are being used responsibly.
So basically a multi-pronged approach to safeguarding our autonomy.
Exactly. So the 10th potential downside that Balvolution highlights is this idea that we could experience a loss of human judgment through over-reliance on AI.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And the concern is that if we become too dependent on algorithms to make decisions for us, we might lose some of our own critical thinking skills.
Yeah, it's like if you don't use it, you lose it.
Exactly. And Belvolution actually references the Deutscher Ethikrat, which has expressed concerns about this. And they give the example of the construction industry.
Okay, interesting example.
Yeah. So imagine you have these automated project management tools that can be really efficient, but they might overlook certain things that an experienced human planner would catch.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like long-term environmental considerations or, the impact on the local community.
Ah, so those nuanced human factors that AI might miss.
Exactly. In Belvolution, they break down the challenges here. So over-reliance on technology could lead to a decline in our own critical thinking abilities.
Because we're not using those muscles anymore.
Right. And then AI decision-making can sometimes lack context sensitivity. It doesn't always understand the bigger picture. Yeah. And then there's the issue of responsibility.
Like if something goes wrong, who's responsible if an algorithm made the decision?
Right. It's a tricky one. So Belvolution suggests that we need to think about developing these hybrid models that combine AI with human expertise.
So it's like a partnership.
Exactly. And then continuing to provide professional development that emphasizes those critical thinking skills. Right. And then having clear guidelines for AI use so we know when human oversight is absolutely necessary.
So it's not a replacement, it's an augmentation.
Exactly. And then regularly evaluating how these technologies are being used and understanding their limitations in different contexts. Mm-hmm. And then fostering a culture that values and encourages human judgment.
So we're not just blindly following the algorithms.
Exactly. So the 11th potential downside that Belvolution brings up is a really thought-provoking one. It's this idea of the homogenization of knowledge through AI.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
So the idea is that AI, it could actually limit the diversity of perspectives that we have access to.
Wow. So it's like AI could actually make us less knowledgeable in a way.
In a way, yeah. And Belvolution, they cite Andrew J. Peterson, who's an AI researcher who's been writing about this potential for a knowledge collapse if AI starts to prioritize only the most popular or widely circulated information.
So it's like an echo chamber effect.
Exactly. And then they bring in Peter Gergetz from the Leibniz Institute for Wissensmedien, who suggests that using tools like ChatGPT, it could actually be outsourcing our own learning process.
Yeah.
Like we're not actively engaging with the information anymore.
We're just letting the AI do the thinking for us.
Right. And Belvolution, they also reference a book by Mario Herger called Wenn Affen von Affen lernen, which translates to When Monkeys Learn from Monkeys.
So it's like we're just mimicking each other instead of coming up with original ideas.
Right. And Belvolution, they give the example of AI-powered research in the building and real estate industry.
So like maybe the research just keeps reinforcing the same trends over and over again?
Yeah. And it might miss alternative viewpoints or innovative approaches.
So it stifles progress in a way.
It could, yeah. So Belvolution, they break down the challenges here. So, a reduction in the variety of information that's available to us, a reinforcement of those existing biases that are already present in the data, and this risk of becoming so dependent on technology that we don't develop our own critical thinking skills.
So it's a real concern.
It is. And they offer some ideas for addressing this. So promoting diversity in the data sources that are used to train AI, that's key, and being transparent about how these AI systems work so we know what criteria they're using to filter information, and then encouraging interdisciplinary approaches.
So bringing different fields of knowledge together.
Exactly. And then, continuously reviewing and adapting these AI systems to make sure they're not inadvertently narrowing the scope of our knowledge. And then educating people about AI literacy so we can be more discerning consumers of information.
So we're not just passively accepting whatever the AI tells us.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on to the 12th potential downside that Belvolution discusses. And this one is about the standardization of market analyses through AI.
Yeah, and this has really practical implications for the building and real estate world.
Definitely. So as Belvolution points out, AI can be incredibly efficient at processing market data.
Like way faster than humans.
Right. But the concern is that it could lead to these standardized assessment methods that don't account for the specifics of different markets.
Right. So it's like a one-size-fits-all approach that might not work everywhere.
Exactly. And this kind of ties back to what we were just talking about with the homogenization of knowledge.
It's all connected.
It is. And Belvolution, they also bring up this concept of KI washing.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It's like greenwashing, but for AI. Basically exaggerating the capabilities of AI or pretending it's doing something it's not.
Exactly. And they even link to a tool that can help identify KI washing, which is really helpful.
That's great.
Yeah. And then they give a really concrete example in the real estate context. So imagine you've got these AI-powered valuation systems, right?
Yeah.
Like Zillow. Yeah, exactly. But those systems, they might not account for unique property characteristics or like very specific local market conditions.
So they could end up giving inaccurate valuations.
Right. And that's a problem, especially in areas that are rural or less developed.
Where the market dynamics might be very different.
Exactly. So Bovolution outlined the challenges here. So you could see a loss of local expertise. Those people who really know the ins and outs of a specific market.
Yeah, their knowledge would be undervalued.
Right. And then if everyone's using the same AI tools, you might see less diversity in market strategies.
Because everyone's getting the same advice.
Exactly. And then there's this concern that we might over-rely on the technology and lose some of our own human analytical skills.
So we need to be careful about that.
Definitely. So Bovolution, they offer some suggestions for how to address this. So incorporating human review into those AI-generated analyses, like a four eyes principle.
So someone's double-checking the AI's work.
Exactly. And then making sure the data sources are diverse, including historical data, cultural data, not just most recent numbers, and then continuing education for professionals on AI and, what it can do and what it can't do.
So they're all more informed?
Right. And then having those industry organizations develop guidelines and standards for responsible AI implementation.
So it's not a free-for-all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, encouraging innovation.
This was Bovolution.
Where construction meets innovation. Until next time, keep building the future.